Okay, I think I'm recording now. Say hello to Mr. Say hello to my little friend. 10:22 is what I want. No, I want 9. I have it mislabeled. Where is it? Come on. See, it's being really weird. My computer is. Okay, let's try this now. Today's the 23rd, and I think it's 7. Come on. Restore. There we go. I think. Let's go. Okay, that. I'll edit this, hopefully. And there is where we left off, right? Excellent. So we were looking at Goya and the capriccios that he did right around the time that he broke up with the Duchess of Alba, and intended as a series of very scathing commentaries on society at the time, and some of them are scathing commentaries on Duchess of Alba as well, right? But that's the long and the short of it with these. What's interesting is the degree to which these, despite the fact that the Spanish state was conducting the Inquisition and was really stepping down on publishing and the freedom of expression, Goya, at the point that these are issued, has little or no persecution, which is odd. In fact, just the opposite. He was already court patron to the king, and in fact, after publishing them, he gave the unsold copies, unsold impressions, plus the plates. He gave them to the king, right? So the king accepted these as a gift from him around the year 1800. Or actually, 1803 was when he stopped sort of printing the first round, right? On the right, we see the family of Carlos IV with Goya in the picture. I know this room is not as good as the other one for pictures, but Goya's on the far left here in the shadows. We'll see him in detail in a little bit. And there's a canvas that he's painting right here, a massive picture. You see the edge of the canvas on angle, and he's got two other massive pictures in the background that nobody's ever identified. But there's Carlos IV here. There's his wife. There's his eldest son there. There's the younger son there. And the rest are cousins and whatnot, right? Extended family members. And Goya is peeking out from just back here. So he's again included himself in the picture. And that makes it very much like what we saw with the Florida Blanca picture earlier, where Goya was again shadowy figure, right? Looking in and presenting to a disinterested Florida Blanca, his portrait that we never get to see. And the same holds true here with Carlos and his family, is that we don't see what he's painting. However, the painting that we're looking at, this one, right, if we were standing in front of it, it's about a little over 9 feet tall, 11 feet across, right? So that means that the painting that we see him working on here, which ends right there, right, is about the right size to be this picture, to make us imagine that we're seeing him painting the picture that we're looking at. Almost as if he's maybe looking at a mirror, you know, and painting what he sees in the mirror just as everybody else is looking at the mirror as well, right? So that we become almost a mirror, if you will, looking at it. And that ought to remind you of something. It certainly reminded Goya of something. The painting really, really well, which is the Las Meninas picture by Velázquez, the court painter to Philip IV of Spain, 150 years earlier, where you can see the degree to which this is really a very close analogy. Large pictures behind him on the wall, playing with the notion of the mirror, which Velázquez has on the back wall here, but also the sense that maybe everybody's looking out at a mirror as he paints. The angle of the canvas very much the same. And again, these are royal family members. The daughter, the beloved daughter of Philip, is here and occupying a very similar position to the younger son here. So this is definitely homage to Velázquez, which I think was intended to please Carlos IV, but we've seen that when it comes to pleasing his sitters, Goya doesn't try too hard. They're really kind of a funny-looking bunch. And no one in this picture is particularly handsome. There's the king with his wife. They look like circus sideshow performers, almost, don't they? Or I always thought, remember the Addams Family? The cartoons that were done for that, for the New Yorker by Charles Addams. Really, I think he's looked a lot at Goya. And one always wonders, it's certainly part of the literature, is whether or not Goya was sort of giving some veiled critique at the royal family, because he seems to have been so skeptical of institutions of government and institutions of any sort. And could he therefore be, offering this sort of underhanded critique of the stupidity of the royal family? That's all well and good, but I don't think that's really true, because, it's a commissioned work by Carlos, and he had to have approved of it. So this seems to have been okay by him, right? You'll notice, I think, you can see the pentimento there, where he's made Carlos a little smaller. You can see how the paint's gone transparent around his right side here, in his head. He sort of pulled him back a bit. Maybe that was flattering in itself, So Carlos anyway had to approve of this, and so he must have liked it. And what's interesting when you think about how kind of unattractive she is, Queen Maria Luisa is her name, is his wife. Carlos, apparently everybody liked him well enough, but he was not particularly strong-willed, and his wife was actually quite diabolical and manipulative, Maria Luisa. And most people at the time believed that Carlos was simply her puppet, because Queen Maria Luisa was sleeping with the Prime Minister. Right? The Prime Minister was the guy that we saw before who had owned the Naked Maya picture that we saw on Tuesday, right? The Naked and the Clothed Maya. He's the owner of that, right? So he's Carlos's Prime Minister. And it's pretty much a well-known secret, if you will, right? Like, it was no great surprise to anybody, and even Carlos knew that everybody needed a henpecked husband, right? A cuckold, as they say. And he was using his affair with Maria Luisa to basically control Spain behind Carlos's back, if you will, although Carlos knew what was going on. And so Carlos really had no real power. Right? He had no real will to exert in the Spanish situation. And you'll notice that he's wearing this amazing splash of military medals and ribbons and everything all over his chest. Look at that. It's almost like a window that somebody took pot shots at, He's got great silver medals and this whole group coming down this way, and then this sash. And these are all military awards, but he didn't earn them. He's just wearing them. And one wonders if that's making up for the fact that he doesn't really have much power otherwise anyway. Right? Well, this is an important thing, this bit of history. And I will give a abbreviated version of it again, right? The easy version. But the bottom line is that since people knew that this Godoy figure, who's not in the picture, he's not part of the family, right? And that would be too much, wouldn't it? Right? Maybe he's under her dress. I don't know. Anyway, the Spanish people want Godoy out of there. And so in 1808, they break out into riots, demanding that Carlos step down simply to get his wife out of power and get Godoy out of power, right? Because if he abdicates, if he steps down as king, then she doesn't have the reins of government in her hands like she does if he's in control. So they want him out only because they want her out, they want Godoy out of the way, right? Spanish people, there's a huge riot in 1808. And to appease the rioters, Carlos decides to give the throne to his oldest son. Right? I'm going to step down, I'm going to pass the crown off to my next oldest heir. This is Ferdinand VII, who's on the left of the picture. You can see him here. And now you can see Goya in the background, directly behind him there, right? So there's Ferdinand in blue, wearing the same diagonal sash and spray of medals that his dad is wearing. So in 1808, Carlos decides, because of the riots, I'm going to give the crown of Spain to my son Ferdinand, okay? Across the Pyrenees, 1808, right? Think of where we are now in France, because Spain and France are separated by a mountain range. That's basically it, right? And so it's not a long haul from Bayonne in France to the other side. And Napoleon is in charge. He's been emperor since 1804, okay? And he has designs on being the ruler of all of Europe. That's what he really wants, right? And so he sees an opportunity, and he says to Carlos, look, I think it's a good idea that you're passing the crown to your son. Why don't you come over to France? My troops will step in, and we'll stop the riot, and then it will be a smoother transition for you to your son. Come on over. Come over to Bayonne. We'll put you up for a bit, right? And so Carlos said, hey, thanks, Nappy. Right? Thanks, Napoleon. We'll be happy to come over there, right? And by the way, remember the families are he's a Bourbon, right? He's part of that old French family that. So there's, he says, hey, I will help you out. And so they go over there, and as soon as they get to France, Napoleon puts them in prison, right? He goes, it's totally a plot, right? Napoleon puts them in prison and forces both Carlos and Ferdinand to abdicate. Right, to give up the throne, and he installs his brother, Joseph, as the King of Spain. This is 1808, right? Sorry? Such an asshole, Yeah. Okay, so long and the short of it is, right? Goya's working for Carlos IV. Carlos IV has problems with the throne because his wife is philandering around. And it ends up costing him the throne and ends up actually leading to a French invasion and occupation of Spain beginning in 1808. Okay? This was in May of 1808. French troops begin to shoot the rioters. He's going to keep that part of the agreement. He's going to stop that stupid. He calls it a little war. This little war with Spain. And you know what the word for little war is in French? A guerre, war, little war, guerre. That's where we get the word guerrilla warfare. Guerre, it comes from this. It comes from Napoleon saying, this isn't a big deal. It's a little war, a little guerre. Yeah. So that's where we get the word guerrillas, where the rioters and little warmongers, if you will. Okay, so he begins to shoot them en masse. Right, in Madrid, but the resistance continues, right? And for many years, for about roughly 3.5 years, the Spanish are able to resist until they're finally crushed by Napoleon's troops. And the French are able to, once they crush the uprising in 1811, they stay in control of Spain all the way to 1813. So basically for the next 6 years, right, 5 or 6 years, Spain is in the midst of this terrible war with France. Okay? And France wins for a short period of time. Right? Then if you know your European history, this leads up to the Battle of Waterloo. Okay? In 1813, the British drive Napoleon out. The Brits they're not liking this whole idea of the new emperor in Rome, right? That's not something they had bargained for. So they want Napoleon out. They send in the Duke of Wellington, right? This is why the Brits call rubber boots Wellingtons, because they're out there trumping in the mud, right? And so 1813 they drive Bonaparte out of Spain, Joseph Bonaparte out of Spain, and the next year they have Ferdinand installed as the next king. So it's not a smooth transition from Carlos IV to Ferdinand VII. There's this 6-year interruption that came from Napoleon's attempt to usurp Spain into the empire, the French Empire. And he's successful for a few years. Right so far? Is that a good short enough version for that? Good. Okay. This is important for us who study art. I love a good story. That's important enough for that. But it's also important for us because during all of this, Goya stays in Spain. He's Spanish, right? He doesn't go anywhere and go in hiding. He's been the court painter to Carlos IV, and one would think that he is going to be maybe in trouble, for having been court painter. But what he decides to do is to hang out and continue to be a court painter, to continue to paint portraits of the invading French. So, he's already made a good name for himself as a portrait painter. So he paints these portraits of the families of the French who have occupied Spain. And we've got one of them downtown. Victor Goya was, in fact, the nephew to one of the most important French generals under Bonaparte. And in this image, he's depicted wearing the uniform of one of the page boys in Napoleon's court. Right? This is a court portrait. Victor Goya, right? So, but Goya doesn't give a rat's ass about institutions of society or loyalty because he's an outsider deaf guy and he doesn't think that he has to be loyal to anybody because he feels alienated. I don't want to go too far with saying what he feels because I don't know what he feels, right? But we get this sense from his works of art that he stands with a great critical distance from the institutions of society, including the institutions of nationalism, of royalty, right? These don't matter to him, it seems. By the way, the uncle that I was talking about, the general, his portrait's down in Richmond at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts in Richmond. So we've got uncle and nephew nearby, right? And you can see he's also wearing his Napoleonic medals. There's the cross that Jacques-Louis David had designed that we saw before, right? And various others. And you can tell, probably from looking at the Napoleonic hat that he's got in his lap, right? So, Goya hangs out in Spain, stays there under the French occupation, and cozies to the French, working for them. Okay. During the same time period, I hope you're not too squeamish, he makes a new series of etchings called The Disasters of War. Here we go. He calls the theme The Disasters of War, the effects of the bloody war against Bonaparte. So it's interesting that he's on one hand working for the French, but at the same time he's critical of the war that they have brought to Spain. And many of the prints say, I saw this. Right? They claim to be drawn from direct observation, and there's no way we can say they weren't. Right? The interesting thing is they were never printed during his lifetime. He dies like in 24 or something, 1824, and the first publication of these plates is 1863. Right? Well after the last of the Bourbon kings is gone. Okay? So he's done these on the quiet. Somebody at the Major Madness on the DL. Right? We used to say on the QT, on the quiet time, not the down low. Right? He's doing this behind closed doors. Nobody knows he's done this. Right? He's etched the plates. He's not got a lot of money, so they're not as beautifully drawn. Although I think they're oddly gorgeous. The line quality, his line quality is just so good. But no one knows that he's sitting on these 82, or is it 82? 82 plates, right? Copper plates that he can print up, and they're not issued during his lifetime. Okay. And they have these titles that are obviously mocking: Great Heroism with Dead Men, right? Or what heroism, great heroism with dead bodies, right? So in other words, he's mocking the idea of war as being heroic. and showing, in fact, that it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. And the sequence of images is also absolutely horrific. And I'm going to show you some of them anyway. All right? The sequencing is terribly important in these. The first 47 of the prints are all documents of the war. And like I said, many of them say, I saw this. So piles of bodies going at it. And what's interesting, a little on the right, the guy in the fur hat with the sword, that's a Napoleonic soldier. Okay? Not a captain, but a foot soldier. And Napoleon actually hired mercenary soldiers, Mameluke Turks, to fight for him, which became part of the propaganda against him. Was like, we're fighting for honor, you guys are fighting for money, right? Because a mercenary gets paid to fight. So the guy with the crossed shoulder pads here, and this helmet, he's a mercenary soldier, and he's part of the invading troops. But what we're seeing is that the horrors aren't limited to the invaders. This is one of the rebels, and he's got another of the invading troops. See the same shoulder straps here? And he's about to cut his head off in full view. And there's another one back here with a knife, and you can see he's got another of them. So the war goes back and forth, and nobody's really exempt. Nobody has to hire moral ground in these images. It's documenting just the absolute horror of these. Let's see what's coming up next, right? Like with the capriccios, we see the darkest things that men can do. We see images of attempted rape. He's about to carry that woman off. She's scratching at his face. The other woman coming back with a knife to try to stop him. These are in aqua tint. It's worth mentioning. I haven't said that before. From intro, you might remember that. But the way he makes these etchings is twofold. One, he puts resin powder on the plate and heats it up, and the resin liquefies. That's what we call aqua tint. And as it does, it forms these little beads of resin that resist the acid when he plunges the plate into the biting of the acid. And where the acid hits, it forms a kind of gray tone, right? So what he can do is he can stop out areas of it, like this here, has never seen the acid, right? This area here saw it only for a little bit. This saw it for much more. But you can see she didn't as well. And what he's done after he's laid down the aqua tint to get the overall gray tone that you see here, lighter one here, once he gets that tone down, and before he puts in the acid, he comes back with a paintbrush and stop out the areas he doesn't want the acid to hit. Okay? So he ends up with a tone block. With like, imagine you're doing a wash drawing with pen and ink, right? And you lay down the wash areas first. That's the kind of effect he's trying to get. He lays down the wash areas, so to speak. And then he comes back over the top of that, and then lays down a layer of wax, and then hits it after it's been etched once, hits it with the lines, puts it back in the acid, and then you get the etched lines. Right? So it's twice through the bath, as it were, in order to get this. And sometimes even more, because you'll notice that some of the tint looks a little bit lighter than some of the other ones. So I stuck it in there for a while, then brought it back out, stopped out this area, stuck it in there longer, because the longer it sits, the darker the lines get. This is aqua tint. He's great at it. It had been used for a little while prior to him, but I don't think anybody's ever lived that has been aqua tint as Goya was. He's the master of this. And it's not an easy etching technique to do. Okay, so they don't want to, right? So these 47 prints illustrate the actual war itself and claim to be things that he had seen firsthand. He is one of the very first artists, really, to show war as horrific rather than heroic, right? And the title of this ties directly into that, Great Heroism of Dead Men. Well, could you say the same thing about West? Great heroism with a dead guy? I think he's making fun of that whole tradition of military paintings that try to elevate it to the status of great tragedy and something that benefits all of mankind, and it's such a good thing to go out and give your life for your country. Goya shows us the true horror of the situation. That's not what it is at all. It's a violent, terrifying thing that reveals the worst of any human's character. And it's not just the invading troops. He depicts the Spanish as bad as well. Okay. So that's the first half, more or less, right, of these 82 prints are the war itself, and they're really horrifying. The next 15 show the aftermath of the war. After the defeat of the rebels, famine set in. And people continued to die, but not at the direct hands of the invading troops. In 1 year, from 1811 until 1812, August to August, within 1 year, 20,000 people in Spain died of starvation. All because the survivors of the war, the French didn't give a flying choose your word, right, about. And so we have a number of images of the people continuing this. So there's a chronological sequencing here. Unlike the Caprichos, which is sequenced differently, right? It's not telling a story. This is attempting a narrative. There's the war, it took up half of it, but when the war is over, it's not over. The horror doesn't end. So they don't arrive in time, and there's a dead body behind them. They're grabbing this woman. She's probably dead or will be dead soon in this image, right? There's no arriving in time for this, right? So there's 15 images of the effects of the famine that followed the war. Finally, the last 15 or so of these, and I got the number wrong, maybe 10, are allegories for what happened in Spain after Ferdinand came back to power. Right, so he keeps working on them after the Spanish throne has been restored. And here they're not direct illustrations, they're all allegories. So they're kind of difficult to understand. And they don't illustrate one person in particular, but they illustrate the institutions of society and how they're not helping matters. It didn't get better. Right? Once the French are gone, it still sucks. Okay? So with this one, you can see this guy with bat wings for ears, right, is writing down what we presume to be, given the size of the book, is probably a code of law. And the title, Against the Common Good, suggests that those laws aren't going to help anyone. And if you look behind him, behind that hill, you can see people with their hands up in trauma, people covering their faces, they cry. Right, this has not helped any. The people who are now back in power, writing the future of the country, are evil. Look at his feet. Look at that gesture. Just one second, I'm busy writing here. Rolls up that taloned hand, right over here. See, so it's really biting satire, but satire is not the right word because it's much stronger and sort of more evil than that. Goya is also very much, sorry about the typo on the title there, the T should be on the second line. He's very much anti-church as well. And again, he doesn't like any of the institutions of society. So here's another figure writing law, right? There's a wolf with a pen on paper and the people cowering behind him. And look who's helping him, holding the dish, his ink pot, right? It's a monk. So in many ways, Goya is making this comment that the church is in collusion with those who are profiting from this war at the expense of the people of Spain, right? The people who need help. Yeah? Now, I left the one on the left up all this horrific time for a reason. It's not the worst one. There's others that are just as bad, of dismemberment and whatnot. I left this up for a reason for all of this, because I think it's a good time to talk about an issue for 19th century art that's really quite important. And the guy puking on your right, What a horrible image, huh? Heartbreaking in a way. This is what you were born for, to die, right? Here's a guy who's come across this pile of dead bodies in this bench and is puking. I want to talk about the issue of what we call the sublime. You might be familiar with the word, but probably not as it was initially intended during the Enlightenment. The issue of the sublime is a very important idea for 19th century art in general, and especially this period as we're transitioning out of neoclassicism. Edmund Burke, English philosopher, wrote about the sublime, and what Burke said was that the sublime is an aesthetic experience. He's really interested in things that give us aesthetic experiences, right? Something that makes us react. And what he said was that beauty is all well and good, but it doesn't make us react as much as other things do. For example, fear makes you react much more strongly than beauty does. Horror has visual horror has an aesthetic reaction, right? When you see it, it's a revulsion, right? And if we're interested in those things as artists, if we're interested in those things that make people respond, right? Then what Burke is arguing is that horror and fear and disgust can be as important as beauty can, because it inspires a reaction. That the visual engagement with it inspires a reaction. Right? And these ideas are floating around from before the time of Jacques-Louis David, right? 1757. That's way back. That's Rococo era, right? But they really begin to take hold sort of end of the 18th and early 19th century, when we start to see this interest in darker subjects that do have an amazing power and are very, very difficult to forget once you've ever seen them. They're really difficult to forget. Like, I dare you to ever forget that image on the left. It's really difficult because it has such a powerful and visceral impact on viewers. And what Burke is arguing, that this is what sublime really means. We use it wrong all the time. Oh, the dessert was just sublime. And that's not what he meant. That's not at all what the word really meant. It's more about this idea of a very, very strong, almost physical reaction to something that is perceived aesthetically. Right? So, this is really important for Goya. Why is he so interested in these images of these? And why do we still find them so interesting? I think that Burke has something to tell us about this, about the issue of the sublime, and it's an important one that we will see come up again and again in the early part and through these half of the 19th century. Okay. Well, these were never published during his lifetime. They were only published in 1863, 40 years after Goya's death. But because he had painted portraits for the French, his patriotism was questioned after Ferdinand was put back on the throne. Okay. At that same time, the Inquisition brought him on trial as well for obscenity, because he had painted the naked Maya. Right? So he gets in trouble as the Spanish retakes the throne of Spain, as Ferdinand VII retakes the throne of Spain. And Ferdinand, because he's known Goya already, is going to do something to try to, come to his support. Right? And what he does is he gets the government to give Goya some funds, some money, to try to paint a memorial to the uprising. And I think what Ferdinand thinks is that Goya will be able to prove his patriotism, right? He'll just say, look, I really had the heart of it. And no one knows these etchings exist, right? So they're not proof in his, right? I don't think he wants to bring them up because they're critical of everybody, right? And you know how it is when you lay out all Hillary Clinton's emails. You're going to find something, right? And so he doesn't want to give them all 82 prints because, yeah, some of them will prove that he really believed that the French were evil people, but they also prove that he thought the Pope was an evil person, and he doesn't want that out there. So, they give him funds to paint, and this is what the commission says: the most notable and heroic actions of our glorious insurrection, our glorious uprising against the tyrants of Europe. Right? And of course, this is given to him in 1814 as Napoleon is being driven out of everywhere. Before he's totally removed from power, but he's obviously on his way out. Okay? So, this is one of the two pictures he does, which is that moment after the mercenary troops have been sent in by Bonaparte, right? To clear the way after Ferdinand and Carlos have been taken prisoner. The troops have been sent in to start shooting the rebels, right? And in order to make the troops supremely evil and the Spanish uprisers, including monks, by the way, supremely good, yeah, unlike the prince, which make everybody bad, right? What he does is he puts the firing squad with their backs to us, standing in lockstep, anonymous, following orders. At the same time, we're absolutely sure that they're mercenaries. They've got those fur hats on. He's got the bright white light shining on the Spanish uprisers, and you'll notice that it's all being done under the cover of darkness, right? At night, because you don't want to do this during the day, right? It's not something you should be doing during the day. It's like when the guy who thought the Baltimore Colts, way before the Ravens, right, moved them to Indianapolis, he did it at night because he didn't want the people of Baltimore knowing he was taking their team and moving to the Midwest. Right? Okay. This is happening at night, and they can see Madrid in the background, and they can see the pile of dead bodies and all that blood. And this poor figure there who's utterly innocent, totally white, his clothing, the symbol of innocence, his hands up like Jesus on the cross, and lit by that box lamp. And you know that in just a second, his shirt's going to be just as red as the ground in front of him. And he's going to jump, he's going to be part of that pile of bodies. So he's really pulling out the stops to say, it's almost like he's going back on himself in a way, because these all show that war is utter horror. And here's what I think it's kind of about the honor of war in a way, because we have a figure who's holy almost, right? And is a martyr to this greater cause. And we have a side that's shown as totally evil, but I think in many ways it's also that Goya showing that this is really a horrific event as well. Yeah.
Was Goya really inspired by the news of Christ in the Gospel, the one on the left?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, totally. I think, he pulls out that thing. In fact, one of the things I haven't talked about yet with Goya very much, and we see it all over the Disasters of War series, and also in the Capriccios, is the degree to which he's looking at traditions in the history of art. Because remember the neoclassical period is all about studying great art of the past and incorporating those into modern things, right? I think of all the Greek sculpture we saw popping up in Jacques-Louis David, right? Well, this is not entirely different from that. And he too is very much inspired by great works of art from the past, whether they are, and he spent some time in Rome as well, but whether they are antique sculptures from ancient Greece and Rome or Renaissance works as well, right? And so I think he's pulling up stops for both of them. Again, the guy tied to the tree, right? Or the upside down figure looking almost like a St. Peter who was crucified upside down, right? I think that if you look long and hard enough with any of these artists in the 19th century, it's not hard to come up with a litany of works that they had in fact looked at, right? But it's, and then there are the people who looked at them, Did you ever see Scarface? The Brian De Palma's Scarface? Well, there's a scene where he ties a guy's hands to I turned it off after this point because I don't really like bloody movies. But he tied a guy to a shower curtain rod and then took a chainsaw to him. And the last shot was the arms hanging from the chainsaw, just like this here. The left, disembodies. Yeah, this is pretty vile. I read an interview with Brian De Palma in Film Magazine where he said, blood, more blood. I'm not making a Disney movie here. Which made me kind of like him a little bit better because he was kind of funny. Well, he turns back, and this goes back to your point, right? The idea that it looks so much like Christ figures. Is he goes back to certain themes that he had begun to work with the unpublished Disasters of War series, and he works those into it. So look at this one, right? Look at the guns coming in from the frame on the right of the print, right? He's made it even more anonymous, hasn't he, with the print? And he's going to rework these themes now into this particular picture. So, and there's another group marching in lockstep back here, and you can see how this body here and this one are very much the same, especially if you remember that the way you make prints is that you have the reversal process, right? And so with that etching, as he drew it on the plate, this figure that's in the foreground here and this one are in fact really quite similar. It's like he's turned the body around but left the leg in the same position, right? And definitely, I think, working with that idea of Christ on the cross as well. But modernized, yeah? Because obviously crucifixion would be kind of heavy-handed. You need to have that subtle undertone of it, right? So, he uses these themes again to now make these public monuments, these two large canvases that depict the very start. And the two of them show the rebel uprising on the 2nd of May, and then the execution of the rebels on the 3rd of May. Right? And your text only gives you the one on the right, but they're both massive pictures. They're both, 11.5 feet across the base, right? 8.5 feet tall. So they're really, really large. And there's a rumor that they were put up in a temporary triumphal arch on either side of the inside of the triumphal arch as Ferdinand came back from Spain. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's one of the rumors about it. And even with the rebel uprising, you can see some of the people that we've already seen in the Disasters of War series, like these people back here. You might remember from some other ones. And then there's some Napoleonic soldiers, but there's also obviously some foreigners fighting for them as well. And then there we have the execution on the right. Goya's focus is entirely on the terror of the victims, the war shown from the victim's viewpoint. This is part of the reason why he puts the executioners with their backs to us. He doesn't want us to see their faces, right? This seems to work because Goya was able to rehabilitate his career, and he goes back to being court painter for the Spanish throne for Ferdinand VII. Up until Ferdinand VII is overthrown in 1820. So for the next 5 years, Goya remains court painter. Even though Ferdinand VII doesn't much like his work, he keeps paying him for these. And Goya, just go away. We don't want you to die, but, I don't have any more work for you. And so he's out of favor with the court. He's still getting money from them. He totally withdraws from public life. Remember that he's, doesn't really much like the public anyway. And over and above that, we think he feels somewhat alienated because he's been deaf now for, 30 plus years, 40 plus years of utter deafness. And, he pulls away. He buys a house outside the city gates in Madrid, seeking total privacy. Rumors start to raise around the city of Madrid about the mad painter in his house. They call it the Casa del Sordo, the house of the deaf man, where he's living, right? And you can see it's almost like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? The house where Boo Radley lives, and all these rumors raise up around that. And while there, he suffers another of these many illnesses that plagued him through his life. And like he had done back in earlier in his life, he decides to try to paint his way through his recovery, right? While living in the house, this house on the outskirts. And what he does is he paints frescoes in his house. 14 huge frescoes in 2 large rooms, decorating the inside of his house in the last years of his life. And that's one of them. in his living room, right? I guess it'd be like having Saw 4 on your TV 24/7, or something like that. Saturn devouring his children. 8 paintings in the living room, and they return to themes that he's been working with his entire life. We'll talk about this one in depth. I'll show a couple of the other ones, right? There's a witch's Sabbath they're called the black paintings because they're so dark. I mean, Goya's been dark all along, except maybe those cute little kids at the very beginning, and Winkle Go flavored stuff, right? But once he figures out what makes his work so good, he just gets so dark. And so they're called the black paintings, yeah. I don't know what they were called in Goya's time, but they were referred to as Goya's black. So there you see again that there's the Pan figure, right? And the witches around him celebrating their black mass here. Also part of the same sequence, these 2 men fighting to the death with clubs in this sort of dreamlike landscape. So these are themes we've seen in his work, right? Disasters of war, the capriccios and whatnot, they reappear here. The scholarly community, the people who study Goya, think that they were all intended as metaphors for aging and death, because at this point he's quite old, 70s or so, and obviously death. And I think he knows he's also dying. He finally dies in 23 or 24. And so if we think about these images of a witch's Sabbath, of men fighting with clubs, we can see them as images of sort of time passing, of things, remembering things done right, maybe things done wrong, aging and death. And with the image of Saturn in particular, in the living room, on the opposite side facing Saturn is this, 2 old men. One leaning on a cane and the other one with his face in the air. Some people think is meant to show deafness, although I don't know exactly why, but with his mouth wide open and sort of howling almost, right? And again, there's more to see in this picture than you can see in this room, right? But they're looking like old hermits. And actually he's got his hand here. Maybe he's the deaf one, because it looks like he's shouting into his ear, doesn't it? Yeah. There's his hand, and his ear is right here. You can actually see his ear. Right? You get the privileged view, right? So there's his ear here, and then the mouth is right next to it there, right? So it's like he's shouting at this guy, right? Screaming into his ear. So this is, maybe like a psychological self-portrait, right? And may or may not look like him. You can look online when I post it, you see it, right? And when we think about these things facing each other in the room, old deaf man facing Saturn. 2 things about Saturn are interesting. The Greek god Saturn, right? Saturn was also known as Kronos, right? Kronos is the god of time. And because Saturn is the god of time, he devours his own children, just as time devours us, right? You guys don't know that, you're too young yet. Right? But it happens, right? You can't do as much as you used to because it's eating away at you one way or the other. And certainly he's commenting on that. If you think about the idea of time devours us, he's commenting on that by the old man leaning on the cane, right? Physically feeble. That's directly facing it. The other interesting thing about Saturn in this particular sequence, if we think about the picture on your right as being a representation of Goya's ideas and thoughts, and maybe Goya himself in a way, facing Saturn. Saturn was also believed to be the god who represented artistic inspiration. That artists were controlled, everyone in the world is controlled by one of the planets. This is the whole idea behind horoscopes, right? That you're controlled by heavens, the stars, right? And people talk about, Moby says we're all made of stars, right? But then beyond that, there's the idea that, the stars the heavens control our actions. And through the Middle Ages, and into the Renaissance, it was believed that creative people were controlled by Saturn. Because Saturn gave them the spark of inspiration, the spark of the gods. And at the same time as that happened, that he gave artists the fury, energy that they need to create, he had to take something back. So he would devour them at the same time. And this is more or less the whole basis of the tortured artist syndrome, right? Kurt Cobain, right? Jimi Hendrix. These are not visual artists, but you get the idea, right? Better to burn out than fade away, my friend Neil Young once said. It's not my friend as long as music, right? And that idea of, live fast, die young, and leave a beautiful corpse, right? That's Saturn devouring his children for us artists in one way or another, right? And here at the end of his life, I think in many ways what Goya is doing is he's meditating on this idea that death is coming, and he's been an artist. And he's ravaged both by Saturn, the god of time, and Saturn, the god of the artist. Poor sad Goya. Oh, God. Listen. He was in his 50s when he was hanging out with the Duchess of Alba in 1798-ish. So this would put him another 25 years later, right? So he's in his late 70s, I think. By the way, there's tons of movies about Goya all over the place. There's Natalie Portman and Javier Bardem as Goya. But there are other, some of them are really good. That was pretty good. That's called Goya's Ghosts. But there's another one called Goya in Bordeaux, where he spent some time in France toward the end of his life. And they tend to be better than your average artist pictures do. Yeah, artist movies tend to be really, really bad. Except Mr. Turner, which was great. And maybe we'll watch that, because we're going to talk about Turner. We should watch Mr. Turner. I love to watch a movie instead of listen to Mark. Okay, so this got us talking about the sublime, right? We're talking about these images that aren't pretty, but have an aesthetic appeal, because we should think of aesthetics as not being only isolated to beauty. Well, think about your senior project, right? Because there's something that you're talking about, ideals of beauty, right? But there are other aesthetic experiences that are beyond that. And Goya's got us talking about it. And as we're going to move now to England for a bit, we're going to see more. Who's working on this? Who's got Fuseli? Yeah, right? More of the same. These aren't pretty pictures, but they're engaging, right? And they're full of fear and anxiety, and they're dark, and they can sometimes be very scary. And it's all about the sublime. It's all about a notion of aesthetics that doesn't rely on beauty, that relies instead on impact, right? On the strength of the experience, right? So as we look at England, it's important to remember that the idea of the sublime, which Goya gets around to around 1800, was born in England, and so we should expect our artists who are active in England to get on the train a little bit earlier, right? And so Fuseli really continues this discussion of the sublime. Right? Pain and fear evoke more profound emotions, more profound aesthetic reactions than beauty does. Beauty is highly overrated, right? This idea of the sublime is a key element of our second major movement that we're going to be talking about, oddly at week 10, 9. But Romanticism is another Enlightenment art and literature movement that runs parallel to Neoclassicism, and both live very deep into the 19th century. Born out of Enlightenment ideas, and also the sublime plays a central role in it. The author that is most influential on Romanticism beyond the sublime with Edmund Burke is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And you might know from the poli-sci class that he's well known for the social contract, which led to the American Revolution. He wrote that. Talked about like the governments have a social contract. But for Romanticism, there's this other famous quote by him. I don't remember what book it comes from. Basically, he says that mankind is everywhere in chains, but he longs to be free. Right? In other words, society is holding us back. Something's keeping us from achieving the greatness that we long for. The freedom to exercise our will. That mankind is everywhere in chains, but longs to be free. And our romantic painters, our romantic authors, find this freedom in areas where logic and rationality disappear. Aha, the sleep of reason, right? Goya, depending on who you talk to, is either a romantic painter or a neoclassical painter. Yeah? And the line between being a neoclassicist and being a romantic is, for many artists, a very thin line indeed, because indeed here, I'm talking about Romanticism with Fuseli, and that's a classical Greek play. Isn't that a neoclassical thing to do? Isn't that what David did? Right? And isn't the date on this around the same time as David? So, where do we put it? And there are neoclassical elements in romantic painters, just as there are romantic elements in neoclassical painters. Right? Think of some of the Davids we saw. Pretty dark images, aren't they? Right? The death of Socrates. Not a particularly happy picture. Right? The death of Marat has kind of romantic elements to it. It's very deep and dark. Right? Romantics are seeing this freedom outside the bounds of logic, outside the boundaries of rationality. Rationality is a set of rules, right? Ratios. Right? Rules hold you back. Right? Logic says that everything has to make sense. That holds you back. So what the Romantic says, we've got to get outside of logic, we've got to get outside of rationality. And they begin to focus on those states of consciousness where rationality and logic don't really matter that much anymore. For example, dreams. Right? Dreams never make sense. But boy, are they sublime, huh? Right? Do you ever keep a dream journal? I never get around to it either. But when you wake up, you're like, didn't my brother turn into a tractor? You know? Right? Insanity. Same thing, right? Images of insanity. Think of Goya's Disasters of Wars. Is that not those insane? Right? Insane actions? Supernatural images. Goya's witches, right? Death. Death is where the final end of anything rational and logic. It's where everything breaks down, right? These are the places where the Romantics find freedom from the rules that keep us from, I guess, is that odd, right? I don't know if you guys all want to kill yourself or something. Death is the place where all of a sudden you're finally truly free. That's what suicidalists always say, right? Oh, they don't always say it because they're dead, but that's, you can imagine they always say. Right? Oop, this is my wallet. Right. The other place they find it, which is not quite so gloomy, is nature. Right? Nature is free. Nature is not bound by human rules. Okay? So, we're going to start talking more directly about Romanticism, starting with Fuseli. As we wind up here today, just a little bit about him, and then we'll talk about painting per se. He was a Swiss artist, but he had moved to England, and so you can probably tell from his last name, which looks more like a pasta than an artist, right? He's from Switzerland, which is trilingual. They speak French, German, and Italian there. And his name was originally, I believe, something like Ferdinand or something like that. Ferdinand Henri Fuseli. So he just goes by Henry Fuseli when he moves to London. But he is a non-native English speaker, right? He comes from Switzerland, and he's one of the founding members of the British Royal Academy, right? So that puts him, we're talking about this in the same breath as people like Benjamin West, Angelica Kauffman, right? Copley, yeah? These are all sort of in the same era and group in England, right? So going back to that era. His father was a Protestant minister. And as a child, Fuseli trained to become a preacher himself, which is kind of cool. Because his images are preachy in a kind of interesting way. And I don't mean that as condescending or anything, but boy, do they have a dramatic story to tell, right? And what we're going to see as we look at Fuseli is that he's very much interested in his literary themes. And that may well come from this background. He's also very much interested in the supernatural and having a preacher for a dad. He's very aware of the metaphysical world, right? So that's it. It's 4:45. We will pick up with Fuseli on Tuesday. And we're not going to spend a lot of time with him, but the order of things is Fuseli, John Constable, landscape painter, like him. He's good. And Turner. And then we'll look at a couple of Americans, Cole and Bierstadt. So, and then there'll be some things online. I'm working that out exactly what that's all going to be. So, to make up for our lost time, because there's some other people that I want to talk, like Blake, that I'd like to talk about, but we may run out of time.